On the night of March 18th, 2004, a woman walked out of Mercy General Hospital in Detroit, Michigan, pushing an elderly man in a wheelchair through the emergency room exit at 10:47 p.m. Within 3 hours, $362,000 would begin moving through a complex web of bank transfers that would take investigators nearly 7 years to fully unravel. The woman's name was Simone Garrett. She was 41 years old, a registered nurse with 14 years of experience, and she had just executed one of the most audacious financial crimes in Michigan healthcare history. What made this case particularly devastating was not just the amount stolen or the vulnerability of the victim, but the fact that Simone Garrett had been planning this for over 2 years. She had studied the system, identified its weaknesses, and exploited the one thing hospitals depend on more than technology: trust. The crime would remain undetected for nearly 18 months. When it finally came to light, it wouldn't be through sophisticated investigation or forensic accounting. It would be because of a single phone call from a nephew who hadn't spoken to his uncle in 3 years and wanted to know why Christmas cards had stopped coming. This is the story of how a trusted healthcare professional spent years gaining access to one patient's complete financial life, how she walked him out of a hospital in plain sight, and how she nearly got away with it entirely. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The victim's name was Harold Weston. He was 78 years old in 2004, a retired automotive engineer who had spent 32 years working for General Motors. He lived alone in a modest ranch house in Dearborn Heights, a quiet suburb west of Detroit, where the streets were lined with maple trees and neighbors still waved from their porches. Harold had never married. He had no children. His closest living relatives were a nephew in Arizona and a niece in Florida, both of whom he saw maybe once every few years at family reunions that grew smaller with each passing decade. He was, by most definitions, isolated, not by choice, but by circumstance and the slow attrition of time. But Harold was far from poor. Decades of steady employment, modest living, and careful investing had left him with substantial assets. His pension was solid. His savings accounts were healthy. He owned his home outright. And he had accumulated investment portfolios that most people would consider a comfortable retirement nest egg. By early 2002, however, Harold's health had begun to decline. He developed type 2 diabetes that required regular monitoring. His blood pressure became erratic. He experienced several falls that left him shaken and less confident in his ability to live independently. He began making regular visits to Mercy General Hospital, sometimes to the emergency room for acute episodes, sometimes to outpatient clinics for routine care. That's where he met Simone Garrett. Simone had been working at Mercy General since 1998. She was well regarded by her colleagues, known for being thorough, professional, and especially patient with elderly clients. She worked primarily in the emergency department during evening and night shifts, the hours when staffing was leaner and individual nurses often had more autonomy. On paper, Simone's life looked stable. She had a daughter in high school, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Redford Township, and drove a 7-year-old Honda Accord. But beneath that appearance of modest stability was a different reality. Simone was drowning in debt. Credit cards were maxed out at amounts that would take her decades to pay off at minimum payments. Her daughter had been diagnosed with a chronic condition that required expensive medication, much of which wasn't fully covered by insurance. Her ex-husband had disappeared years earlier, leaving her with no child support and no way to track him down. The apartment she rented was in a building where the heat barely worked in winter, and the landlord was threatening eviction over late payments. She had refinanced everything she could, She had taken extra shifts until she was working 60 hours a week and still falling behind. She had applied for loans that were denied. She had asked family members who had nothing to give. By the time Harold Weston became her patient for the third time in the spring of 2002, Simone Garrett was desperate. And desperation has a way of making people notice things they might otherwise overlook. Harold came into the emergency room that April evening, complaining of dizziness and confusion. His blood sugar had spiked dangerously high. Simone was assigned to his care. She took his vitals, started an IV, administered insulin, and sat with him as he stabilized over the course of several hours. During that time, they talked. Harold was lonely. Simone was kind. He told her about his years at GM, about the house he'd bought in 1971, about how quiet life had become. She listened with genuine attention, the kind of attention that elderly patients rarely receive in busy emergency departments. Before he was discharged that night, Harold mentioned that he was worried about managing his medications. Simone offered to help him organize a pill schedule. She wrote down her work number and told him to call if he had questions. He called 2 weeks later. Over the following months, their relationship evolved. Simone began checking in on Harold between her shifts. She would stop by his house to make sure he was taking his medications correctly. She helped him organize his paperwork, which had become overwhelming. She drove him to appointments when he felt too unsteady to drive himself. To Harold, Simone was a godsend. To his distant relatives, who barely called, her presence was unknown. To the hospital, she was simply a dedicated nurse going above and beyond, something that wasn't uncommon in healthcare, especially with isolated elderly patients. But Simone was learning. She was observing. She was gaining access. Harold kept his important documents in a filing cabinet in his den. Bank statements, investment reports, insurance policies, pension information, all of it organized in manila folders with handwritten labels. He trusted Simone enough to let her help him sort through it when bills came due, and he felt confused about which ones to pay. She began to understand the full scope of his finances. The checking account with $43,000, the savings account with another $87,000, the brokerage account with stocks and bonds worth approximately $180,000, the pension that deposited $2,800 every month like clockwork. She also learned that Harold had no power of attorney, no living will, no trust. He had never gotten around to setting up the kind of legal protections that estate planners recommend. His niece and nephew were listed as beneficiaries on some accounts, but they were passive designations, not active management. In the summer of 2003, Simone took the first concrete step. She convinced Harold to add her as a joint account holder on his checking account. She framed it as a practical safety measure. If something happened to him, someone would need to be able to access funds to pay his bills. He was in the hospital at the time, recovering from a minor stroke that had left him frightened and vulnerable. He signed the paperwork without hesitation. The bank processed it without question. Joint accounts were common for caregivers and elderly clients. There was nothing legally wrong with the arrangement as long as Harold consented, which he had, in writing, in person, with his own signature. Simone didn't take anything at first. For months, she simply had access. She watched the account. She studied the patterns of deposits and withdrawals. She noted that Harold rarely checked his statements carefully. She observed that his nephew and niece never called to ask about his finances. By late 2003, Simone had a plan. It was methodical, patient, and depended on one critical factor: timing. She began researching power of attorney documents. She learned about notarization requirements, witness rules, and legal language. She discovered that in Michigan, power of attorney could be established relatively easily with the right paperwork and proper witnessing, and that hospitals often had notaries on staff who could validate such documents. She also started moving small amounts of money, $20 here, $50 there, small enough that Harold wouldn't notice, large enough to test whether anyone was paying attention. No one was. In January 2004, Simone presented Harold with paperwork that she claimed would help streamline his medical billing. She told him that the hospital was changing its systems and that patients with complex medical histories needed to designate someone to handle insurance claims and coordinate payment. The documents looked official. They had the hospital logo at the top, professional formatting, legal language about authorization and responsibility. Harold skimmed them. He trusted Simone. She had been helping him for nearly 2 years. She had never given him reason to doubt her. He signed. What Harold didn't realize was that buried within that paperwork was a durable power of attorney that gave Simone Garrett complete control over his financial and medical decisions. The document had been notarized by someone Simone knew outside the hospital, a notary who didn't ask questions and processed the paperwork for $50 cash. With that signature, Simone now had legal authority to access Harold's accounts, make financial decisions on his behalf, and act as his representative with banks and investment firms. But she still needed one more thing. She needed Harold out of the picture, not permanently, not violently, just removed from his normal environment where neighbors might check on him, where mail might pile up suspiciously, where questions might arise. She needed him somewhere isolated, somewhere she could control, somewhere that wouldn't raise immediate alarms. On the evening of March 18th, 2004, Harold Weston was brought to Mercy General Hospital by ambulance. He had called 911 complaining of severe abdominal pain and difficulty breathing. The paramedics found him at home, conscious but distressed, and transported him to the emergency department where Simone happened to be working that night. Whether Harold's symptoms were genuine or induced would later become a subject of investigation. Toxicology reports would be inconclusive. What is certain is that Harold arrived at the hospital, was treated for what appeared to be gastrointestinal distress and dehydration, and began to stabilize over the course of several hours. At 10:47 p.m., the emergency department had quieted down. The day shift chaos had faded. Most patients had been treated and discharged. The waiting room was nearly empty. Security footage would later show fluorescent lights humming overhead, chairs arranged in neat rows, notices about patient rights hanging undisturbed on the walls. Simone entered the frame pushing a wheelchair. Harold sat in it, wearing a hospital gown with a thin blanket across his legs. His shoulders were rounded, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He appeared tired, subdued, compliant. She moved at a steady pace, not fast, not slow. Her expression was neutral, focused on the path ahead. She didn't look back. She didn't scan the room for observers. The automatic doors slid open as they approached. No staff member intervened. No questions were asked. At that hour, discharges happened quietly. Patients left. Paperwork was assumed to be complete. The system relied on routine and trust. Simone guided the wheelchair through the doorway with practiced ease. For a brief moment, both of them were framed perfectly in the exit. An ordinary hospital scene recorded thousands of times every year at facilities across the country. Then they passed out of view. The doors closed. The waiting room returned to stillness. At the time, nothing about the footage stood out. It wasn't flagged. It wasn't reviewed. It was simply stored, time-stamped, and filed away. Just another clip among countless hours of surveillance. But what happened next would transform that mundane footage into evidence. Simone didn't take Harold home. She drove him to a small extended-stay motel on the outskirts of Warren, Michigan, a facility that catered to long-term guests, and didn't ask many questions as long as the rent was paid weekly in cash. She had rented a room there 3 days earlier under a false name, paying for the first month up front. The room was basic: 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a bathroom, a television mounted to the wall. It had the kind of industrial carpet and generic landscape paintings that defined every budget motel in America. But it was private, isolated, and located far enough from Harold's neighborhood that no one who knew him would accidentally pass by. Simone told Harold that he needed to stay there temporarily while his house was being treated for a mold problem that had been discovered during a routine inspection. She had paperwork to back up the story, official-looking documents about environmental hazards and remediation timelines. Harold, still weak from his hospital visit and trusting Simone completely, accepted the explanation without resistance. She made sure he was comfortable, left him with groceries and his medications, and told him she would check on him daily. Then she drove back to her apartment and opened her laptop. At 1:23 a.m. on March 19, 2004, the first bank transfer was initiated. Using Harold's online banking credentials, which she had obtained months earlier under the guise of helping him set up automatic bill payments, Simone logged into his checking account and transferred $15,000 to an account she had opened 2 weeks prior at a different bank under the name of a limited liability company she had registered for $200 through an online legal service. The LLC was called Great Lakes Healthcare Consulting. On paper, it appeared to be a legitimate medical consulting business. In reality, it was a shell, a name with a tax ID number and a bank account, nothing more. Over the next 4 hours, Simone initiated a series of transfers. She moved money between Harold's accounts first, consolidating funds from savings into checking to make larger withdrawals possible. Then she began transferring amounts to the LLC account: $18,000, $22,000, $30,000, each spaced approximately 30 to 40 minutes apart. She was careful not to drain the accounts completely. She left enough to cover Harold's pension deposits and automatic bill payments. She wanted the accounts to appear active, functional, normal, at least for a while. By dawn on March 19th, she had moved $127,000. She stopped then, closed her laptop, and went to work her scheduled shift at the hospital. She moved through her duties with her usual professionalism, showing no signs of stress or distraction. Colleagues would later tell investigators that she seemed completely normal that day. Over the next 2 weeks, Simone continued the pattern. She visited Harold at the motel every few days, bringing him food and ensuring he took his medications. She kept him calm, reassured, and compliant. She told him the mold remediation was taking longer than expected, but that everything was being handled. Meanwhile, she systematically dismantled his financial life. She contacted his brokerage firm, identified herself as his power of attorney, and requested that his investment accounts be liquidated and the funds transferred to his checking account. The brokerage required documentation, which she provided: the power of attorney paperwork, Harold's social security number, account numbers, security questions she had learned the answers to over months of conversation. The brokerage processed the request. By early April, another $180,000 had been moved into Harold's checking account, and from there into the LLC account in carefully structured transfers designed to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems that flagged transactions over certain thresholds. Simone understood that banks monitored for suspicious activity, but she also understood that those systems were primarily designed to catch external theft. Hackers, identity thieves, criminals with stolen credentials. They were less equipped to detect authorized users making legitimate-looking transfers, especially when those transfers were spaced out and appeared to follow normal patterns. She had researched structuring laws and knew that multiple transactions just under $10,000 could raise red flags. So she varied the amounts: $7,200, $14,800, $11,300, $9,650. She made them at different times of day. She mixed in smaller transfers that looked like ordinary bill payments. By mid-April 2004, Simone had moved $362,000 out of Harold Weston's accounts. The LLC account held the money for exactly 3 days before she began the next phase of her plan: dispersal and laundering. She had researched this carefully. She knew that large deposits and transfers left paper trails. She needed to move the money into forms that were harder to trace and easier to use without raising suspicion. She began by purchasing cashier's checks in varying amounts from different banks, using the LLC account as the source. She made the purchases over the course of 2 weeks, visiting different branches, using different tellers, never buying more than 2 checks in one transaction. She then deposited those checks into multiple personal accounts she had opened at various credit unions around the Detroit metropolitan area, small institutions that weren't networked together, where a new customer depositing a $15,000 check might raise an eyebrow but wouldn't trigger a fraud investigation, especially if the check was drawn from a legitimate-looking business account. She also purchased prepaid debit cards in large denominations, which she could use for everyday expenses without creating traceable connections to her primary bank accounts. She bought money orders to pay off her credit card debts, sending them from different post offices with no return address. The largest single expenditure was paying off her apartment rent arrears and prepaying 6 months ahead, $8,400 total, which she delivered to the landlord in cash, claiming she had received a settlement from a car accident. She paid her daughter's medical expenses in full for the year, catching up on overdue bills and settling debts with the hospital and specialty pharmacy. Another $11,000 gone, but this time into legitimate medical billing systems where the payments appeared routine. She was methodical about not spending flashily. No luxury cars, no designer clothes, no sudden vacations to exotic locations. She understood that sudden wealth displays were red flags. Instead, she focused on eliminating debt, creating stability, and building a foundation that looked like gradual financial improvement rather than a sudden windfall. By May 2004, the LLC account was empty. The multiple personal accounts held smaller amounts, $8,000 here, $12,000 there, distributed across institutions. Simone's credit cards were paid off. Her daughter's medical bills were current. Her rent was secure. She had even managed to save $30,000 in cash, which she kept in a lockbox hidden in her apartment closet behind boxes of old clothes. Harold Weston remained in the motel, increasingly confused and disoriented. Simone continued to visit him, but less frequently now. She told him the mold situation was being resolved, but that he should stay put just a bit longer. In late May, she made a decision. She couldn't keep Harold in the motel indefinitely. Questions would eventually arise, but she also couldn't return him to his home where neighbors might ask questions, or where his nephew and niece might suddenly decide to check in. She needed a solution that would explain his absence without implicating herself. On June 2nd, 2004, Simone called 911 from a payphone outside a gas station in Warren. She reported finding an elderly man who appeared confused and disoriented, wandering near the motel. She gave the address, but didn't leave her name. When paramedics arrived at the motel, they found Harold in his room, dehydrated and showing signs of severe cognitive decline. He couldn't clearly state his name or where he lived. He had no identification on him. Simone had taken his wallet weeks earlier, claiming she needed it to update his insurance information. Harold was transported to a different hospital, not Mercy General, but Providence Hospital in Southfield, where he was admitted under observation for altered mental status and failure to thrive. Without identification, the hospital registered him as a John Doe and began working to establish his identity through fingerprints and missing persons databases. It took 4 days before his identity was confirmed. By then, Harold's cognitive state had deteriorated further. Doctors suspected a combination of factors: prolonged isolation, medication mismanagement, possible mild strokes and severe anxiety. He was transferred to a skilled nursing facility for long-term care. His nephew in Arizona was finally contacted, the first time anyone in Harold's family had heard from him or about him in months. The nephew was shocked, confused, and immediately suspicious. Why hadn't anyone noticed Harold was missing? Why had he been in a motel? Where was all his documentation? But even then, the financial crime wasn't immediately discovered. Harold's mail had been forwarded to a PO box that Simone had set up using his power of attorney. His pension continued to deposit. His bills continued to be paid automatically. From a cursory external view, his financial life appeared intact. Simone, meanwhile, had severed all visible connection to Harold. She stopped visiting. She avoided any contact with the hospitals or nursing facility. She continued working at Mercy General, maintaining her professional reputation, showing no signs of guilt or anxiety. She had gotten away with it. For nearly 18 months, no one knew. Harold remained in the nursing facility, his cognitive decline making it impossible for him to provide coherent accounts of what had happened. His nephew tried to piece together the situation, but faced barriers at every turn. Privacy laws, bureaucracy, the complexity of navigating someone else's financial systems without proper documentation. The nephew eventually gained guardianship and began the process of sorting through Harold's affairs. But even then, the theft wasn't immediately obvious. Harold's accounts still existed. They still had money in them. The amounts Simone had deliberately left to avoid raising immediate red flags. It wasn't until October 2005 that the nephew finally accessed Harold's full banking records. He had been trying for months, frustrated by privacy regulations and the difficulty of proving his authority to various financial institutions. When he finally received complete statements going back 3 years, he sat down with a calculator and began reconciling deposits against withdrawals. The numbers didn't make sense. Large transfers with no clear purpose. Money moving between accounts in patterns that didn't match Harold's simple lifestyle. And then the massive withdrawals in March and April 2004. Hundreds of thousands of dollars gone in a matter of weeks. The nephew contacted the bank's fraud department. They launched an internal investigation. Within 2 weeks, they identified the LLC account as the destination for most of the transfers. They traced the account to Simone Garrett. They contacted the FBI. Special Agent Jennifer Chen of the FBI's Detroit field office took the case in November 2005. She reviewed the banking records, the power of attorney documents, the hospital records from March 2004, and the security footage that had been archived but never reviewed. When she watched that footage of Simone wheeling Harold out of the emergency room at 10:47 p.m. and then compared the timestamp to the first bank transfer at 1:23 a.m., the case crystallized. Agent Chen interviewed staff at Mercy General. She learned about Simone's relationship with Harold, the visits to his home, the gradual assumption of responsibility for his care. She obtained records from the motel where Harold had been kept. She tracked down the notary who had validated the power of attorney documents. Each piece of evidence built a clearer picture. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a long-term plan, executed with patience and precision by someone who understood the systems she was exploiting. In January 2006, FBI agents arrived at Simone Garrett's apartment with a search warrant. They found the lockbox with $22,000 in cash still remaining. They found paperwork related to the LLC. They found bank statements from the multiple accounts. They found notes, detailed notes, about Harold's routines, his security questions, his automatic payments. Simone was arrested and charged with wire fraud, theft from an elderly person, identity theft, and financial exploitation. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. During her interrogation, Simone initially maintained her innocence. She claimed that Harold had authorized all the transfers, that she had been managing his money at his request, that she had only been helping him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, the bank records, the testimony from the motel staff who had never seen Harold leave the room during his stay, the medical reports showing his deteriorated condition when he was found. In August 2006, facing the weight of evidence and the recommendation of her public defender, Simone Garrett accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to wire fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. In exchange, the other charges were dropped and prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence on the lower end of federal guidelines. In November 2006, she was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $362,000 to Harold Weston's estate. At the sentencing hearing, the judge noted the premeditated nature of the crime, the exploitation of trust, and the vulnerability of the victim. But the judge also acknowledged Simone's lack of prior criminal history and the desperate financial circumstances that had motivated the crime. Harold Weston never recovered his cognitive function. He remained in a nursing facility until his death in 2009 at the age of 83. His nephew and niece inherited what remained of his estate after legal fees and restitution recovery efforts. The house in Dearborn Heights was sold. The accounts were closed. Simone Garrett served 6 years of her sentence before being released in 2012. The restitution order remains in effect, though collection has been minimal. A few $100s per month garnished from whatever work she has been able to find. She will likely never pay back the full amount. The case led to changes in hospital protocols at Mercy General and across Michigan healthcare systems. Staff members are now required to report any financial involvement with patients to ethics committees. Power of attorney documents must be reviewed by legal departments. Security footage from emergency room exits is reviewed weekly rather than archived indefinitely. But the deeper lesson of this case is about the invisible nature of elder financial exploitation. Harold Weston was isolated, trusting and dependent on someone he believed was helping him. The crime unfolded over years, hidden in plain sight, enabled by systems that prioritized efficiency over scrutiny. On that March night in 2004, when Simone Garrett pushed Harold through those hospital doors, she wasn't just removing him from the emergency room. She was erasing him from his own life, his home, his finances, his autonomy, his future. And for 18 months, no one even noticed he was gone. The investigation that followed Simone Garrett's arrest revealed layers of planning that even seasoned FBI agents found remarkable in their detail and patience. Special Agent Jennifer Chen would later testify that in her 15 years investigating financial crimes, she had rarely seen a perpetrator who had invested so much time in preparation while maintaining such disciplined restraint during the execution. The FBI's forensic accounting team traced Simone's research back nearly 3 years. Her personal computer, seized during the search warrant execution, contained browser history showing hundreds of visits to legal websites explaining power of attorney laws, estate planning forums, and elder care advocacy sites. She had studied the very systems designed to protect people like Harold in order to exploit them. What disturbed investigators most was evidence suggesting Harold wasn't her first target, just her most successful one. Records showed that Simone had developed similar relationships with at least 4 other elderly patients at Mercy General between 2001 and 2003. She had visited their homes, helped with medications, gained their trust in nearly identical patterns. With 3 of those patients, the relationships had remained genuinely helpful. She had assisted them with organizing their lives, but never crossed into financial exploitation. Investigators theorized that Simone had been testing approaches, learning what worked, understanding the boundaries of the system before committing to a full crime. The 4th patient, an 82-year-old woman named Dorothy Reeves, presented a more troubling picture. Dorothy had died in 2003 of natural causes related to heart failure, but bank records showed several suspicious transactions in the months before her death, transfers totaling approximately $18,000 that had moved into an account investigators couldn't definitively trace back to Simone, but which showed patterns eerily similar to the LLC account used in Harold's case. Dorothy's family had never pursued the matter. The amounts were smaller. Dorothy's estate was more complex, with multiple beneficiaries and existing debts. The missing money had been written off as end-of-life expenses or poor record-keeping by an elderly woman in declining health. No investigation had been opened. No crime had been reported. The realization that Simone might have successfully stolen from Dorothy Reeves, learned from that experience, and then refined her approach with Harold Weston added a chilling dimension to the case. This wasn't a desperate woman making one catastrophic mistake. This was someone who had tested, learned, and escalated. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of Simone's pre-sentencing investigation painted a complex portrait. Dr. Raymond Phillips, a forensic psychologist contracted by the court, spent 12 hours interviewing Simone over several sessions. His report noted that she demonstrated no signs of antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. She expressed genuine remorse for harming Harold. She acknowledged the wrongness of her actions, without minimizing or justifying them. What Dr. Phillips found instead was a woman who had been functioning in a state of chronic desperation for so long that her moral reasoning had gradually eroded. The financial pressures hadn't appeared suddenly. They had accumulated over years, each new crisis layering on top of unresolved previous ones until Simone felt she was suffocating. Her daughter's medical condition required medication that cost $1,400 per month after insurance. Simone's income as a nurse, while respectable, left little margin after rent, food, and basic expenses. She had tried every legitimate avenue: payment plans, charity care programs, medication assistance programs. Some helped temporarily, but none solved the underlying problem. Dr. Phillips noted that Simone had first begun fantasizing about stealing money around 2001, but those fantasies had remained abstract. Lottery-style daydreams about finding money or receiving unexpected windfalls. It wasn't until she met Harold and began understanding the accessibility of his finances that the fantasies became concrete plans. The transformation from fantasy to planning to execution had taken nearly 2 years. Dr. Phillips described it as a process of moral licensing, where Simone had gradually convinced herself that Harold's isolation meant the money wasn't truly needed, that he would never miss it, that she was more deserving because she would use it to care for her daughter rather than letting it sit unused in accounts. By the time she actually executed the theft, Simone had rationalized it so completely that she genuinely believed, at least in some compartmentalized part of her mind, that she was solving a problem rather than committing a crime. The nursing community's reaction to the case was intense and divided. Some nurses expressed sympathy for Simone's financial desperation while condemning her actions. Others saw her as a betrayal of everything the profession stood for. The Michigan Nurses Association issued a statement emphasizing that the vast majority of nurses worked with vulnerable patients every day without ever exploiting them, regardless of their own financial struggles. But the case also sparked uncomfortable conversations about the working conditions and compensation in healthcare. Multiple nurses came forward anonymously to describe similar financial pressures, the impossible math of providing care to others while struggling to afford care for their own families. While none defended Simone's choices, many acknowledged understanding the desperation that had preceded them. Mercy General Hospital faced its own reckoning. Although the hospital wasn't held legally liable for Simone's actions, which had occurred largely outside the scope of her employment, the case exposed significant gaps in oversight. The hospital's ethics policies had no clear guidelines about nurses forming personal relationships with patients outside work hours. There was no system for tracking whether staff members were visiting patients at home or assuming caretaker roles beyond their professional duties. The hospital administration launched an internal review that revealed Simone hadn't been alone in developing close relationships with patients. Several nurses regularly helped elderly patients with tasks beyond medical care: grocery shopping, bill paying, transportation to appointments. Most of these relationships were genuinely beneficial and never crossed ethical lines. but the hospital had no way of distinguishing between appropriate helpfulness and potential exploitation until something went wrong. New policies were implemented requiring staff to report any non-professional contact with patients to their supervisors. Nurses who wanted to help patients beyond their clinical duties had to work through the hospital's social work department, which could coordinate legitimate community resources and volunteer programs. Home visits were prohibited unless officially documented and approved. The changes were well-intentioned but created new problems. Some nurses complained that the policies criminalized compassion and made it harder to provide holistic care. Patients who had benefited from nurses' extra help found themselves suddenly cut off from support systems they had relied on. The rigid boundaries, while protecting against exploitation, also eliminated positive relationships that had genuinely improved people's lives. For Harold Weston's nephew, Michael, the aftermath of the case brought a crushing sense of guilt that no legal resolution could ease. During multiple interviews with investigators and later with journalists covering the case, Michael repeatedly blamed himself for his uncle's vulnerability. He had known Harold was aging and isolated. He had known his uncle's health was declining. But Michael had his own life in Arizona, a demanding job, 3 children, a mortgage. The distance felt overwhelming. Phone calls became perfunctory, birthday cards became sporadic, visits became excuses. Michael told investigators that he had thought about checking on Harold more frequently, but had always convinced himself there would be time later, that Harold seemed fine during their brief conversations, that surely someone would alert him if there was a real problem.